Saren Vale was not the kind of woman who looked for trouble. Trouble, however, had a way of finding her anyway. She was kneeling in the mud outside her cottage when she first saw him. Her hands were wrapped around a small barn cat with an injured leg, and she was working carefully, trying not to startle the animal further. The morning was cold and still, the kind of cold that sits in the bones and refuses to leave, and the village square of Eldenmore was just beginning to wake up. Then the sound of hooves broke through everything. A black horse came through the square at full speed, its rider dressed in dark riding clothes, a dozen mounted men following behind him. The horse nearly clipped her shoulder as it passed, spraying mud across her face and coat. The cat shrieked and bolted. Saren sat back on her heels and looked up. The man on the horse had stopped. He was looking down at her with an expression she recognized immediately, the expression of someone who had never once considered that someone else might be in his way. He was large, sharp-jawed, with gray eyes that looked like they had forgotten how to be warm a long time ago. Everything about him said power. Everything about him said he knew it. "Watch where you ride," Saren said. The square went completely silent. The man stared at her. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite contempt, but something in between. His companion, a broad man riding just behind him, leaned in and murmured something. "A healer," the companion said quietly. "A human healer," the rider corrected, in the tone of someone explaining why a thing did not matter. Then he turned his horse and kept moving, and the whole procession swept forward like Saren had never existed at all. She stood up slowly, brushed the mud from her hands, and watched him go. His name was Kaelin Draveth. She would learn this later, from the elder's wife, who came to her cottage that afternoon to warn her that the Alpha King himself had arrived in Eldenmore for border negotiations, and that everyone should be on their best behavior. Saren had simply nodded and gone back to grinding her herbs. She had lived in Eldenmore her whole life. She had been born in the back room of the same cottage where she now worked, delivered by her grandmother's hands into a world that had always been half wolf and half human, always uneasy with itself. Her mother had been a healer, her grandmother before that. The knowledge passed down through their bloodline like water passing through stone, slowly, completely, leaving its shape behind. She treated everyone who came to her door, wolf shifters with broken bones, children with fevers, elders with joint pain so deep it had settled into their personalities. She did not ask who they were or what pack they belonged to. She asked where it hurt. That evening, she was invited to the clan elders' gathering, a long table dinner where the Alpha King and his officers would be hosted before the formal negotiations began the next morning. Elder Bran had asked Saren to attend because she had been treating a respiratory illness spreading through the younger wolves at the village boundary for nearly 3 weeks, and he wanted her to speak briefly about what she had found. She arrived quietly, sat near the end of the table, and waited for her moment. She did not get it. Somewhere in the middle of the meal, one of Kaelin's younger officers, a genuinely curious young man who was new to the Northern Territories, asked about the village's approach to medical care. He had heard about the local healer, he said. He found it interesting, the way these old border villages maintained their own traditions. Kaelin answered before anyone else could. He spoke about village healers, the way someone speaks about a thing they have already decided on. He called them relics. He said the practice was about comfort, not cure, about making frightened people feel that something was being done when really nothing was. He used the phrase comfort theater. He said the real problem with border villages was their attachment to superstition when proper pack physicians were available. He said all of this at a table where Saren was sitting 8 seats away with her notebook in her lap. She closed the notebook. She thanked Elder Bran quietly, told him she would send her written notes in the morning, and left. She was not angry, not in the sharp and burning way. She was something quieter. She was tired, the way you get tired when something happens that you have experienced before and expected never to stop experiencing. She walked home through the cold dark, put her kettle on, and sat by the fire with her cat, who had come back with a splinted leg and absolutely no interest in gratitude. She thought about the wolves at the boundary. The illness had been tricky. It had started like an ordinary chest infection, but it had changed, adapted, begun resisting the standard treatments that the pack physicians used. She had been tracking it carefully, noting which compounds touched it and which ones it ignored. She had started to understand its pattern. She thought about writing to the pack physicians to share what she had found. Then she thought about what Kaelin had said, and she decided she would wait for them to ask. 3 nights later, at the forest edge just beyond the village, a silver-black wolf collapsed. His name was Kale. He was Kaelin's bonded wolf, the animal half of a shifter's soul, the part that could not be separated from the person without consequence. And he had the same wet, rattling sound in his lungs that Saren had been listening to for 3 weeks. In the younger wolves she had been treating, the illness had found its way to him. The pack physicians were summoned from the capital. They arrived within hours, professional and efficient, carrying cases full of medicines that had been developed in well-funded facilities by people with long credentials. They examined Kale thoroughly. They conferred with each other in low voices. They administered 3 different treatments in careful sequence. By dawn, Kale was worse. Kaelin did not leave the animal's side. He sat on the ground beside the wolf in the way that only a bonded person can, with his hand buried in the creature's fur, feeling every breath. The pack physicians came to him just before sunrise and told him, with great professionalism and genuine regret, that the pathogen appeared to have changed. It was not responding to anything they had brought. They would send for more medicines, more specialists. It would take time. Kaelin looked at the wolf. Kale's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and effortful, like every breath was a decision being made. "Is there anyone else?" Kaelin asked. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that contains an answer that no one wants to say first. His companion Dario was the one who finally spoke. He said it simply, without judgment, without any sign that he remembered what had been said at the dinner table 3 nights ago. "There is the woman from the village," Dario said. Kaelin was quiet for a moment. "The healer." "Yes." Another silence. Kaelin looked at Kale. Kale's sides rose and fell with a sound like something tearing, very slowly. "Send for her," Kaelin said. Dario wrote the message himself. He had worked beside Kaelin for 11 years and knew when to quietly improve upon instructions. The summons he sent to Saren's cottage was respectful in wording and honest in urgency. It did not beg, it did not command. It explained. Saren read it twice at her kitchen table in the early morning light. She thought about the dinner. She thought about comfort theater. She thought about a wolf who had done nothing wrong except belong to the wrong person. She picked up her satchel and walked into the cold. When she arrived, she moved directly to the wolf without looking at Kaelin. She knelt beside Kale and began her assessment with the quiet, unhurried focus of someone who has been doing this since childhood. She pressed her ear to his side and listened. She checked his tongue, the color of his gums, the temperature of his paws. She opened her notebook and read her 3 weeks of observations, comparing what she heard against what she had documented. The pack physicians watched her. Kaelin watched her. Nobody spoke. After 10 minutes, she sat back and began opening her satchel. "I know what this is," she said to no one in particular. "It shifted about 9 days ago. The standard treatments push it sideways, but they do not stop it. What stops it is older." She took out a series of small cloth pouches and a flat stone she used for grinding. She also took out a pair of clean linen wraps, which she wound around her hands before dipping them in a prepared compound she had carried with her in a sealed jar. One of the pack physicians cleared his throat. "What technique is this?" "Ground binding," Saren said simply. The physician's expression changed. 2 of the others exchanged a look. One of them turned to Kaelin and began to explain, in careful language, that ground binding was a restricted practice, prohibited under territorial law in 7 of the 9 pack regions, that the laws dated back 300 years and were still technically enforceable, that they were not in a position to authorize this. Saren did not look up from her work. She was still preparing. Kaelin looked at the physician. Then he looked at Kale, whose breathing had gotten worse in the past hour. Then he looked at Saren, who had wrapped her prepared hands and was waiting, with complete patience, to be told whether she was allowed to save the wolf's life. "You can stop me," she said quietly, meeting his eyes for the first time since she had arrived, "or you can let me work." Kaelin said nothing. He stepped back and sat down against the far wall, and he did not take his eyes off her. It took 4 hours. Saren worked in near silence, her wrapped hands resting against Kale's side and chest in a steady, sustained contact that looked, from the outside, like nothing much at all. She murmured to the wolf now and then, not prayers, not spells, simply information. She told him what she was doing. She told him what to expect. She described the sensation he might feel as the compound began to work its way through. A warmth, then a loosening, then something like being able to breathe fully for the first time in days. Kalen watched the whole thing. He had expected impatience from himself. He was a man who acted, who decided, who moved. Sitting still in a corner, watching a woman with wrapped hands press them against his wolf's ribs for 4 hours was not in his nature. But he did not move. He watched, and he noticed things. He noticed that she did not perform. She did not look around to see if anyone was observing her. She did not explain herself, or justify herself, or seek approval. She was entirely focused on the animal in front of her, and everything she did was in service of that focus. He noticed that Kale, who had been rigid with tension and discomfort all night, began to relax in small degrees under her hands. His ears, which had been flat, slowly came up. His breathing, around the 3rd hour, began to ease. By the 4th hour, it had become deep and even. Kale opened his eyes. The room was very still. The pack physicians, to their great credit, said nothing. Dario let out a slow, careful breath. Kalen was off the wall, and on his knees beside the wolf before anyone else moved, his hand in the silver-black fur, his forehead dropping briefly to the animal's neck. When he looked up, Saren was already unwrapping her hands. She was checking her supplies, making a note in her book, putting things back in her satchel with the same calm efficiency with which she had taken them out. She was not waiting to be thanked. She was leaving because her work was done. "Wait," Kalen said. She stopped. She turned around. He was still crouched beside the wolf. He looked, in that moment, very unlike an alpha king. He looked like a person who had spent a night being afraid and had now come out on the other side of it, tired and honest. "I said things at the gathering," he said, "about healers, about what you do." He paused. He was not a man who had practiced this kind of sentence. "I was wrong, and you still came." Saren looked at him for a long moment. There were many things she could have said. She was aware of all of them. What she said was, "Kale will need 3 more treatments over the next week. I will need access in the mornings." She left without another word. Kalen let her go. For the next 7 days, she came each morning. She treated Kale. She spoke to him in the quiet, conversational way she spoke to all her patients, explaining the process, describing what was happening in his lungs, telling him he was doing well. By the 2nd morning, Kale had begun to watch for her at the door. By the 3rd morning, his tail moved when she came in. Kalen was present every morning. On the 1st day, he stood near the wall. By the 3rd day, he was sitting on the bench closer to the center of the room, and he was asking questions. They were careful questions at first, skeptical questions, the questions of a man who was rearranging something in his mind and needed to understand what he was rearranging. She answered them plainly, without pride and without defense. He learned about the illness, about how she had tracked its mutation over 3 weeks, about the compound she had developed through a combination of her grandmother's notes and her own observation. He learned that her bloodline had been practicing ground binding for over a century, carefully and quietly, in the spaces that the territorial laws left unwatched. He learned that she had treated 47 wolves in the past year alone. On the 5th morning, he asked her why she had come when he summoned her. She looked at him over her notebook. "Because Kale did not say any of those things," she said. On the 7th morning, Kale was fully recovered. He stood at the door of the room, looking entirely like himself, large and silver, and deeply unimpressed by the fuss that had been made over him. The pack physicians shook Saren's hand. 2 of them asked if she would share her treatment notes. She gave them copies she had already prepared. Kalen made a quiet legal declaration the following week. On its surface, it addressed updated medical practice standards in the territories. In its details, it removed the 300-year-old ban on ground binding. It did not make a celebration of this. It simply changed what needed to be changed. He returned to Eldenmore 3 weeks later. He came alone, without ceremony. In the late afternoon, when the light was long, and the herb garden outside Saren's cottage was gold at the edges. He knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at him without surprise, the way you look at someone you have already understood. "I would like to know more about what you do," he said, "if you are willing to teach." It was not a grand statement. It was not a declaration of anything. It was simply a man standing at a door, asking to learn from someone who knew more than he did, which is one of the hardest things in the world for a person like him to do. Saren opened the door wider and stepped aside to let him in. The village of Eldenmore talked about that week for a long time afterward. They talked about many things: the wolf that had been saved, the treatment no one had seen before, the old laws that quietly disappeared. But what they talked about most, the thing they kept returning to in their conversations around winter fires, was something smaller than all of that. It was the image of the most powerful man in 9 territories, sitting on a wooden bench outside a healer's door, in the early morning cold, waiting patiently for her to finish her work. Not summoning, not demanding, just waiting. And how, when she finally came out, she handed him a cup of tea without a word, and he took it with both hands, and they sat together in the pale morning light, like two people who had decided, without making a speech about it, to begin again.